The goal of this video will be to review one of the most important ethical theories in the history of Western philosophy, namely utilitarianism. So let's start with some historical background for utilitarianism. The theory was defended by John Stuart Mill and is a version of consequentialism. You can think of consequentialism as a broad range of ethical theories which emphasize the consequence of the action, as opposed to the intention, the kind of action done, or the character of the person who does it. So remember our map of the aspects of action. We can contrast the intention with the kind of action and with the consequence, and consequentialism is the view that focuses on the consequence. What makes utilitarianism a distinct version of consequentialism is the way that it evaluates the consequence of the action. So Mill articulates a version of utilitarianism which is hedonistic in nature. You can think of hedonism as the theory of the good life, which says that pleasure is the most important, or at least a very important, aspect of human flourishing. So if we're thinking about what we need in order to live a good life or to have well-being, hedonism is the view that pleasure is primary or very important. So on Mill's account, happiness is equivalent to pleasure and unhappiness is equivalent to pain. And he thinks we should evaluate the consequence of an action based on the pleasure and pain produced. His theory, utilitarianism, has one major ethical principle, and we call that the greatest happiness principle. So recall that ethical principles are guiding statements which instruct us on how to act and evaluate the actions of others. So they're simple statements which we can apply to the choices that we're making or the decisions we've made in the past. And likewise, they're principles we can utilize to evaluate what other people do. Mill's greatest happiness principle says the following: actions are right or ethical as they tend to promote pleasure, wrong as they tend to promote pain, for the greatest number of persons, each counting equally. Okay, so on the next slide, I'll break down each of the component parts of this principle. So I think there's three distinct features or clauses of this principle. The first is that it measures the consequence of the action based on pleasure and pain promoted. So if we look at the statement of the principle, it says that actions are right as they tend to promote pleasure, wrong as they tend to promote pain. And this clues you in on the idea that the greatest happiness principle is consequentialist in nature. It's consequentialist in nature because it's about what the action promotes, or in other words, what happens after the action. Therefore, the principle is not primarily concerned with what the action involves or the intention of the person does it. Rather, it's concerned with what happens after the action. Second, it requires us to consider all persons impacted by the action. That's why he says, for the greatest number of persons. So anytime you do an action, your action will have a consequence, and depending on the kind of action, other people or other beings might be impacted by your action. And Mill thinks that when we evaluate our actions or when we make decisions, we should think about how our decisions will impact all people who can be affected. So that's what he means by the greatest number of persons. And then, just as important, he says that it requires us to count each person equally. And so it requires impartiality. So essentially, we can't put our pleasure and pain ahead of or in front of the pleasure and pain of other people. And we can't be partial regarding other people who are impacted. So we can't put our friend and their pleasure and pain ahead of the pleasure and pain of strangers, because each person ought to count equally. This is Mill's attempt to build in some sort of fairness to the principle. So I recommend that we think about the greatest happiness principle as a decision-making procedure. And I think it should be viewed as a decision-making procedure because it provides us a specific process for deciding what action we ought to do or evaluating an action which has been done. So it's a process because it's a step-by-step formula we can utilize in order to make decisions that Mill thinks will be ethical. So when deciding what to do, you should, firstly, think through each possible course of action. So before you act, think about all of the things that you can do when you find yourself in a particular circumstance. As you think about each possible course of action, think about each person that will be impacted by the decision you can make. So different courses of action might impact different kinds of people, and you should consider how each decision will impact people. Next, you evaluate the likely quantity of pleasure and pain experienced by each person who will be impacted. So think about each course of action, think about who will be impacted, and think about who will be impacted in terms of the pleasure and pain promoted for each of those people. And then finally, calculate which course of action produces the most amount of pleasure and least amount of pain in the aggregate or in sum. So you add up all the pleasures and you add up all the pains and you weigh them such that each person's pleasure and pain counts equally. And you should do that action which brings about the most pleasure and least pain in the aggregate. And if the action's already been done, you can use this formula in order to praise the action or condemn it. Now, one thing that you'll notice if you read Utilitarianism is that Mill spends very little time defining and explaining his major principle and significant time articulating possible objections to the view. And this is a tradition of philosophy because thinking through how a person might object to your position is an important strategy because it provides insights into how to strengthen one's position, especially if one is able to respond to the objections. So if you're offering a specific position, you want to be able to think about how other people will object to it. You want to try to find the flaws in it and be able to respond to those criticisms. Because if you can respond to those criticisms, you will have a strengthened view. Second, B, it displays fair-mindedness and intellectual humility because it shows a willingness to consider the views of others with generosity. So another reason for considering the objections a person might raise against your position is that it shows that you're open-minded about the possibility of being wrong. And if you're open-minded about the possibility of being wrong, then you're not dogmatic. And dogmatism is rarely a strategy for figuring out what's right or true. And since the goal of philosophy is to figure out what's right and true, dogmatism is unproductive. So by considering the objections to others, we open ourselves up to the possibility that we have something to learn from others. And we open ourselves up to the possibility that there's always more to learn about the topic that we're studying. So Mill considers objections to his view, I think in the spirit of both of these considerations. So here are some objections to utilitarianism. I'm going to consider 3 objections that come from Mill's book, Utilitarianism, and then 1 objection that comes from secondary literature about Mill's book. So according to Mill, some may be worried that the principle is just too demanding. Why would it be too demanding? I think this is because of its egalitarian nature. The principle is egalitarian because it requires us to consider how all persons will be impacted by our actions, and then to count the pleasure and pains of each person equally. So this raises the concern that we're simply not capable of taking account of the well-being of so many persons. So if each time I act, I have to think about how all the persons who could be impacted by my action will experience pleasure and pain, and always count each person's pleasure and pain equally, then I might need to consider many more people and the well-being of these people than I'm actually capable of. In other words, it may be the case that we're only able to include so many people within the realm of our moral concern. And this might be justified or explained by the science of human beings. So one way of looking at this would be to think about how we've evolved over time. It may be, for example, that our moral tendencies, our tendencies to think about right and wrong, are a product of our evolution. And we likely evolved from small groups, hunter-gatherer tribes. So these were small groups of people, and we gained the ability to be concerned about how our actions impact each member of the group. But these were very small groups. These were tight-knit groups. So it's not clearly the case that as we move into larger and larger societies, we gain the capacity to care about more and more people. A contemporary version of this worry is that in a globalized society, there is the possibility that we can negatively impact people on other sides of the planet. So we have the potential to impact many, many people, many, many more people than we've evolved to be concerned about. And so Mill's principle just might have too broad a scope, and therefore it might be too demanding. So Mill is going to respond to this objection by arguing that the greatest good of society will generally be promoted by each person focusing first and foremost on their own well-being. So Mill is going to counter this objection by saying, in general, his principle doesn't require us to greatly expand our scope of responsibility, and therefore it's not actually as burdensome as it first appears. He reasons that each member of society benefits from all other persons doing that which is necessary to enhance their standing in society. So Mill is going to note that one of the major drivers of a well-functioning, happy society is each person tending to and cultivating their own well-being and their own natural skills, capacities, and tendencies. So I greatly benefit in the society that we live in from people seeking out what they care about and pursuing it. And I benefit in two ways. First, I benefit from their services and knowledge. So for example, if I become sick with cancer, then I benefit from the doctor who spent their life researching how to cure cancer. And I benefit from it, secondly, because if each person is in fact cultivating their own interests and capacities and skills and talents, then they're less likely to be dependent on the rest of society. In other words, they're more likely to be self-functioning, and that will benefit all of us. On the other hand, if people don't tend to their natural skills and capacities and don't put their well-being first, then they're more likely to be in need of extra support. So here I just gave an example of what I think Mill means here. Instead of donating her tuition payments to those most in need, which might satisfy the immediate needs of people in society, for example, by helping them make ends meet or have the adequate food and nutrition that they need, the doctor who develops her natural skills and talents and becomes an excellent doctor benefits society at large. And this is despite the fact that her initial decision had a self-interested motivation. In other words, she wanted to have a good career. So in general, Mill's principle, he says, doesn't require us to sacrifice our own interests because the greatest good of society is made up by decisions of individuals who pursue and develop their own interests and natural abilities. Objection 2. This objection is that the principle is too burdensome. So Mill notes that some may be concerned that his principle is too burdensome to follow with regularity. And this worry will be based on the concern that it's not feasible to work out the calculations regarding who will be impacted by our actions and the amount of pleasure and pain that will be promoted for each course of action. So think about the decision-making procedure I suggested earlier. Think about each possible course of action. Think about who will be impacted by each possible course of action. Weigh the likely pleasures and pains promoted or produced for each person by each course of action. And do that action which in the aggregate or in sum brings about the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number. That is a lot to think about every time you decide to do an action. So the principle may be too burdensome in the sense that it requires us to do an impossible calculation. And this would run against what we want in an ethical principle. Because after all, we turn to ethical principles because they provide good guidance and they allow us to make a decision. But if the utilitarian calculation takes too long because it's so cumbersome, it won't allow us to make a decision in a necessary time frame. Contrast that with a principle that says, never lie. Well, if we're thinking about whether we ought to tell a lie or not, and we're using Mill's greatest happiness principle, we have to think through the possible consequences of lying and who it'll impact, and not lying and who it'll impact, and weigh the pleasures and pains of each person that will be affected by the lie or by the truth-telling, and then only tell the lie if it's the action which brings about the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number. Contrast that with a principle that just says lying is bad in itself, so you ought not to do it. The principle which says lying is bad and thus you ought not to do it provides ready guidance for an agent who is considering whether they ought to lie. And so it will allow the agent to make a decision, let's say, within the necessary time frame. And so that might be a better principle, at least from the practical perspective. All right, Mill's going to reply to this objection by observing the long history of experience we possess as agents. So Mill's going to point out here that each of us grows up and has many experiences that instruct us about morality. It instructs us about morality because we're able to see how actions produce certain kinds of consequences. And then we're able to see how those consequences impact other people. So we do this first by practicing. So part of childhood development is play acting morality with young children. And then at the same time, we're being instructed by adults who explain to us the consequences of our actions. And they set an example by doing kinds of actions which either benefit or harm others. And we see this as we grow up. And then by the time we're adults, we have gained a lot of experience. And moreover, we have the arts and literature and history and philosophy to provide us background knowledge about the history of humanity and the decisions human beings have made. And all of that serves as data that we have at the ready when we need to make a decision. And so it's rarely the case, says Mill, that we interface with situations so wholly novel that we can't roughly determine the impact of our choices. So Mill thinks this is overblown. He thinks that in general, we're going to have the skills and capacities to make quick judgments about how our actions will affect others. Objection 3. This objection says that the utilitarian principle we call the greatest happiness principle is insensitive to character. It's insensitive to character because the principle focuses solely on the consequences. And as a result of focusing solely on the consequences, it overlooks the character of the person who does the action and or the intention for which they do it. But you might think, in evaluating the actions of others, it seems to matter whether they do the action with the right intention, because we do talk about good and bad intentions. And we sometimes say that a person was right to do an action because they had the right intention, even if it didn't bring about a good consequence. And it seems to matter whether they in general possess a good character. We also talk about persons in terms of the character they possess. And a strict focus on consequence is going to overlook these features. All right, Mill's going to reply to this worry by noting firstly that intentions are difficult to decipher. I think what he has in mind here is the idea that intentions are mental states, and mental states are imperceptible to others. So if I see you do an action, I can't directly perceive the intention that you have because your intention is a state of consciousness that's inside of you, that's internal to you. To contrast, I can see the consequence of your action because the consequence of your action is going to occur mostly outside and in the world. And so it's going to be both observable and measurable. A way to think about this is to think about a murder case. Suppose someone is being tried for murder, and the jury is trying to determine whether, in fact, it was murder or merely manslaughter. The question about whether it's merely manslaughter or, in fact, murder turns on the question of the intention of the person who did it. So imagine it's 2024 and you're a jury on a case, and you're trying to determine whether the agent who killed committed murder. And this requires you to think about the night they committed the act. And let's suppose that the night they committed the act was 2019. And you're trying to figure out whether they intended to do it. Well, trying to figure out whether they intended to do it involves thinking about their state of mind in 2019, now that we're sitting here in 2024. Here, it's going to be hard to know exactly what we're looking for when we look for the intention, because that was a mental state that occurred at a specific time. It came and went. It's no longer observable. Mill's going to point out here that in contrast to intentions, the consequences of actions are readily observable and therefore measurable. He's going to say, therefore, one of the best ways we can evaluate a person's character is by evaluating the regular consequences of their actions. For a person who's got a good character will likely be the person who brings about, in general, good consequences. Then he directly responds to the worry that the principle overlooks the character of the agent. And he does so by conceiving of the following objection. He says, imagine a person with an evil character, someone who's very bad. But then imagine them doing a good and praiseworthy action. And it's good and praiseworthy, let's say, because it brings about great consequences. It really benefits people in need, let's say. Would we, Mill asks, condemn the action that this person did merely on the grounds that the person who did it possessed a bad character? To the contrary, it seems like the goodness of the action stands independent of the character of the person who did it. And indeed, to the extent that they did a good action, that would, after all, count in favor of their character. Perhaps they would gain some credit with us. Maybe they would do something to rehabilitate their reputation in society by doing this good act. All right. Finally, objection 4. This isn't going to come from Mill's writing. This is going to come from the secondary literature. And this is the objection that his principle can't account for justice or fairness. Justice or fairness are basic terms in morality that involve treating all persons equally or respecting the rights of individuals. Some will object to the theory on the grounds that it can't account for the related notions of fairness or justice. And the worry that it can't account for the related notions of fairness and justice will stem from its focus on the consequence alone. By focusing on the consequence alone, Mill's principle overlooks the kinds of actions that are done to achieve the consequence. In other words, it overlooks the means by which the ends are obtained. One way of thinking about the rightness of actions is to think about what they involve. And we sometimes think that certain kinds of actions are bad in themselves. Like many in the United States think that torture is bad in itself. And what we mean when we say torture is bad in itself is that torture can't be justified by the consequence of torturing. Because it involves a violation of the rights of the person who's tortured, for example. Because the principle focuses wholly on the consequences, it overlooks the question of the means used to achieve the consequence. So there's a classic thought experiment in normative ethical literature about utilitarianism, which goes something like the following. Imagine that a town is experiencing a wave of violent crime, and this violent crime is greatly disturbing the population, such that it's causing a lot of unhappiness, or as Mill would call it, pain. The police department can't figure out who is committing these violent acts, and it knows that if it can prevent these violent acts, that will promote the greatest good of the town. In other words, it'll greatly enhance the pleasure and reduce the pain of the town. And since it can't figure out who is doing it, it comes up with the following strategy. It decides that it will frame an innocent person and accuse them of committing the violent acts. And in addition, it will severely punish them for doing it. This all with the aim of achieving the good consequence of a reduction in crime. Now let's suppose it actually works. They successfully frame the innocent person, and they punish them severely. And as a result of their so doing, whoever was actually committing the crime stops doing it. Here the worry is something like the following. The greatest happiness principle might very well justify the police department in doing this. Because after all, it promotes the well-being of the greatest number, each counting equally. So even though it would cause some real suffering for the one person framed, that suffering would be outweighed in the aggregate by all the people who have benefited by the reduction in crime. Now you should pause and think, well, would it be justified indeed for the police department to do this? And I think the intuition here is that it wouldn't be, because it's firstly dishonest, and secondly a violation of the rights of the innocent person. And it's just a violation of the general idea of why we punish, right? We punish because people deserve it, for example. And so it seems like the greatest happiness principle, focusing on consequences alone, doesn't have a means for including certain aspects or considerations about justice or fairness, and therefore can justify our doing unethical actions for the sake of good consequences.